regular night, the first Monday of every month, usually down at the library in the meeting room. But I had such a big response from the emails and texts that were sent out, I figured we better have it in a place that would accommodate us all. Here's what we're going to set up. I'm not going to have the regular meeting with the notes and the minutes and everything as we've done in the past, but I'm going to have Don explain everything with his PowerPoint, and he will show you exactly what he's talking about considering the overlay. If you have questions, if you will just raise your hand, and then please come up to the microphone and speak, because I'm hard of hearing, and I need to have clarification of what you're saying. So the other thing I would like to do is I would like to say a prayer. I have family and friends that live in El Paso. I lived there for 38 years. And I was terrified till my son finally called me and said, "We're okay, Mom, we're okay." And my cousin her husband is one of the doctors that received the victims. And I talked to him tonight, and he's devastated. He's just exhausted and devastated. And if we would say a quick prayer, a silent prayer. Years ago, there was an old Don McNeil radio station. He said, "Let's all say a prayer, each in his own way. Bow your heads and let us pray." Amen. All right, Don, I'm going to turn the meeting over to you. And like I said, if you have questions, hopefully he'll have answers. And I've told him, if you don't have the answers, say that you'll get back to us, please, because we do need the questions and the answers as well. Yeah. You want to?
Before we get started on the meeting, I'd like to pass these out. You guys have an idea for the program chairman, and I'd like to get some input, and this is the biggest meeting we've had so far.
That's for our November chili supper. And we had an excellent speaker at our picnic, which is a glorified word for having it indoor at the gymnasium, which is much better than having it over at the pavilion like we used to have at 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It was awful. So that's when they changed it over to having it in air-conditioned places, and it's so much better. I think we all had a really good time. And I do want to thank our state representative, Brad Buckley, for attending and giving the speech, as well as our state senator, Don Buckingham, who dropped by to say hello to all of us. Now, if you have a suggestion for the speaker in November, please write it on the slip of paper and let Mary Ann have that, because you can't do things like this too far in advance. And I'm an organized person. So anyway, Don, if you would like to proceed with the meeting.
Absolutely. My name is Don Ferguson, and I'm the city administrator, and I apologize for sitting down, but I'm married to this computer tonight. I'll stand up at some point in the presentation to be a little bit more informal, so apologize if you feel I'm being rude in any way by sitting. But Judy asked me sometime back whether I'd be willing to come and visit with you all about some discussion that's been taking place at City Hall over the last few months about potentially the creation of what is called a historic overlay district. And I'm going to get into the situation in just a moment, but I want to give you a little bit of history as far as how the topic of discussion came about. If you're familiar with city government in any way, you know that cities are required to have what are called master plans or comprehensive plans. And those are kind of the Bible for our development. They're intended to kind of set the tone, set the course, set the character for the community, and we're supposed to adopt regulations that move in that direction. From time to time, those plans are obligated to be updated, about every 5 to 7 years typically, and then maybe after, maybe 3 or 4 of those updating cycles, you literally go through a complete rewrite, because they recognize communities grow, communities change, they develop, and conditions around the communities change. So the village a few months back launched the process to update its comprehensive plan. It was the first update of the comprehensive plan that occurred. The plan was adopted shortly after we incorporated back in 2000, and we didn't go through the seven-year update. We waited a little bit longer than that, but the board decided to go ahead and move forward with that, and we went through a process where we updated that plan. We literally went page by page, line by line, and updated it to go through the process of trying to make it more current. In the process of reviewing that plan, there was a lot of interest expressed about historic preservation and about doing what we can as a community to maintain our historic district. And the question came up among some of the members of the comp plan committee, and that is, are we doing it right with the way we're set up, or is there a better way to do it, and in a way to make it a little bit more understandable and flexible? In the course of those discussions, the committee, as part of its recommendations to the board, came forward with a recommendation to create what is called a historic overlay district to help protect the historic area of this community from a long-term perspective. And I know that's foreign language to a lot of you who aren't in the business of city government, but basically it is a blanket. It is a protection blanket. And you have the ability to set any restrictions you want on that blanket, and that blanket would apply basically to the area that you call the historic district. So let's kind of start with that background in mind and talk through the process. Zoning is one of the things that comes out of the comprehensive plan process. The comprehensive plan process establishes a map that shows intended land uses or preferred land uses in part of the community. And what cities do is they take that land use map and they go and they zone the properties according to that land use map. So if the land use map shows an area should be residential, they'll go in and zone that area as residential. Single-family residential, multifamily residential, those type of things. If they see an area that they want to be commercial, they may call it local retail or regional retail. Different types of classifications. Every city has kind of different zoning designations to identify the land uses. But what they do is they take that land use map and they go in and they zone the properties according to that. Zoning basically is the process of dividing land in a city into zones, example, as I mentioned, retail, residential, and industrial, in which certain land uses are permitted or prohibited. Zoning may specify a variety of permitted and conditional uses of land. It may also indicate the size and dimensions of the land area as well as the form and the scale of the buildings. These guidelines are set in order to guide urban growth and development, as we talked about. In brief, a zoning designation typically identifies the use of that property. If the property is currently being used as a retail store, okay, and if the land use plan said we'd really rather that be a church, or we'd really rather that be a restaurant as opposed to retail, the city has the ability to go in and zone that property as it sees the use intended. That doesn't mean it can no longer continue to be used as a retail outlet. That's a pre-existing non-conforming use. It's a grandfathered use. It means, though, that the intended use for that property would be a restaurant if they wanted to make it a restaurant, or a church if they wanted to do that. And if at any time the grandfather goes away, then its intended use should be that. So we zone properties. All properties in a community are supposed to be zoned. And those zoning designations have certain regulations. Certain zoning districts have larger setbacks as opposed to other zoning districts that may have smaller setbacks. Certain zoning districts allow more impervious cover or allow taller buildings or smaller buildings. But zoning districts are intended to try to help a community develop and to manage the growth and development of that community. Examples of the zoning district regulations, as I mentioned, lot size, building size, impervious cover, building setback, permitted and conditional uses, prohibited uses. What is a conditional use? A conditional use is not a prohibited use, but it's not a permitted use. It basically is a use that the village, in setting up the regulations, says, you know, in certain circumstances, this might not be a bad use for this property, but there may be a need to allow this use with conditions. And so they allow what's called conditional use permits. And so we have different conditional uses in our various zoning districts, as most cities do. We have permitted uses in our zoning districts, as most cities do. And the prohibited uses go without saying. If it's not listed as a permitted, if it's not listed as a conditional, then it's just not allowed in that particular zoning district. In addition to base zoning, which we just talked about, the base zoning, the established zoning district for a piece of property, cities have another tool that's afforded to them in regulating land use. And it recognizes the fact that there may be some areas of a community that need additional regulations other than those that are set forth in their base zoning. They may be located, that land may be located in an area that may have certain sensitivities that other parts of the community don't have. And the way cities are allowed to deal with that is they're allowed to create what are called overlay districts. That's the protected blanket you put on top of the regular zoning that's in place. So it is additional regulations for that area of town, recognizing the unique nature of that area of town. So the definition of an overlay district is a zoning district which is applied over one or more previously established zoning districts, establishing additional or stricter standards and criteria for covered properties in addition to those standards of the underlying zoning district. Communities often use overlay zones to protect special features such as historic buildings, wetlands, steep slopes, business quarters, waterfronts. I think the operative phrase in this definition I just gave you is there are additional regulations. So if your property has a base zoning of commercial or local retail, if you will, you have to live by those local retail regulations. And if there's an overlay on top of that, those are additional regulations on top of those you already have to live by that you have to follow. It's not intended to choke you to death. It's intended to protect the purpose of that overlay district. And as I mentioned, overlay districts have various purposes. You can have, for example, an overlay district that would deal with the properties that are located right on the creek or on drainage areas. You typically see what are called protected waterway overlay districts, which have limitations on development on the water to try to protect the water quality and to try to protect the environment. The interstate. We have right now a West Side overlay district in our current zoning code that has different commercial development standards or additional commercial development standards than those set forth normally in regional retail or in the local retail zoning district. So it's a set of additional regulations that are intended to accomplish protection. A historic overlay district is one of those opportunities. A historic overlay district is a layer of local planning regulation which incorporates restrictions of the underlying zoning for a given geographic area with the main goal of preserving the historic character of a neighborhood. Who has them? A lot of cities have them. Georgetown, Round Rock, Temple, Waco, just to name a few, have overlay districts in this area. Some of them are far more great in detail than others, but they all have that intended purpose of providing additional regulation to protect and preserve the character of the area that they're intended to do so. Examples of the type of additional regulations. We mentioned in the base zoning district, in the regular zoning on your property, you have things like setback, impervious cover, building height, those type of things. In an overlay district, you may want to take it a step further and get into architectural features, especially in the historic overlay district. You may want to look at building colors and materials, individual building elements, site design. That's a big one. How the building is positioned on your lot. Are they all separated? Are they all equidistant from each other? Are they all backloaded on the lot, front-loaded on the lot? Signage. You clearly don't want a bunch of neon, backlit, fluorescent signs all over your downtown historic area. That's just not Salado. You may want it on the interstate in a commercial area, a commercial complex, but you recognize the fact that there are certain characteristics that are unique to certain areas of town, and the way you do that is you create this overlay blanket with those additional regulations to address that specific area, all of the properties in that specific area, regardless of how they're zoned as far as their base zoning. Mass and scale is another one. Do you want a bunch of 9,000 square foot buildings in your historic overlay district? Or 15,000 square foot buildings in your historic overlay district? Probably not. You want buildings that are massed and sized according to the area where they're located. Clearly, those size buildings don't fit on Main Street. They may fit on 35, but they don't fit on Main Street. Specific land use restrictions. You have the ability in an overlay district to go in and identify what types of zoning, what type of base zoning you want to allow in that overlay district. For example, you may not want to allow fast food restaurants. You may not want to allow banks. You may not want to allow nightclubs and bars, those type of things. So you have the ability to go in the overlay and establish the certain types of land uses that are permitted in that overlay district. So you're beginning to see the difference. It's an additional layer of regulation that's intended to protect. It is not intended to lessen the significance. To the contrary, it's intended to increase the significance and provide long-term protection for that particular area. So what's the issue we're dealing with in Salado that came up in the comp plan discussion? And I see Jim Lasher in the back, and Jim was the chair of our comp plan committee, and he may want to come up and make a comment or two after we finish tonight to kind of give you his thoughts as far as the situation goes. But what is the issue we encountered in the comp plan review process? Well, right now, all of the properties located in what is known as the historic area of Salado are individually zoned historic district. Their base zoning is historic district. And I'd ask you the question right now, what does that mean? What is the land use? You tell me it's local retail, that means it could be a bookstore, it could be a jewelry store, it could be something like that. What is historic district in the way of land use? Maybe a museum? Yeah. But there's one museum in town. What about the other properties located in that area? So what we've looked at in reviewing and looking back on what we've done, and this isn't bad, this isn't critical of the past, but we think maybe a better way to go about it is to go into that zoning district and zone the properties within the historic area, those that are zoned historic district right now, and zone those properly according to their land use and their desired and intended land use. If they're local retail, let's zone them local retail. That's more definitive for people when they're, number one, they're buying property. It's more definitive when they're trying to understand rezoning of property. It's very difficult to define the use historic district. So that's one of the things that came up in the discussion. In the historic district zoning regulations, in the HD zoning district regulations, the restrictions that are in place right now don't appear to be as tailored towards historic preservation as they could be. And that's not a critical statement. Again, our ultimate goal, Jim, correct me if I'm wrong, but our ultimate goal in this discussion was we want to do things to tighten and to increase the protection of the district, to better define it, to showcase it, to give those who come into this community in the future that want to develop in that area the guidance they need and the ease they need to come in and build and grow within the district like everybody else wants and everybody else is doing. But you have to give them the standard to help them do that. And right now, maybe we're not as definitive as we should be with our regulations to give people the standard. I can tell you that at this stage of the game in the process, this modification, should it progress, is not happening without every one of you involved in the process. That point was made from the beginning at the table with the comp plan. It was made at P&Z. It was made at the Board of Aldermen meeting when we went through it. And that is, it is imperative that the Historical Society be at the table when any modifications are established in our regulations relating to the historic district. But I will also tell you this, and that is, when you get into this process, you're going to need to take a step back as an organization, as a unit as a whole, and decide, what is historic? What does the district mean? What is it we're trying to protect? What is it we're trying to preserve? I'm telling you right now, I see 50 people in this audience tonight, and I guarantee you there are probably 49 different definitions of what it is we're trying to preserve and protect. So that's the challenge we face. You ask Tom and members of the P&Z, every one of them has a different idea too. That's natural. That's the way it is. But I think it's going to be important, and I think the board feels it's important, that this organization be at the table and be a driving force at the table if and when there's any type of redevelopment of regulations, the establishment of this historic district. It's not going to be a board decision by itself. It's not going to be a P&Z decision. You're part of that team in the decision-making process. Just like if and when we get into looking at our protected waterway, our waterway areas, we're going to engage the property owners in that particular area too, and those that have a special interest in that area. You need to be part of the local regulation process. We're not saying that the wheel that we're driving on right now is broken in any way. What we're saying is we can make it spin better by making these particular moves and make it function maybe a little bit better, make it more easily understood, and make it more normal for what people typically encounter in municipalities when it comes to historic preservation. You had a tremendous presentation from the folks from Georgetown several months ago that I had the opportunity to attend. And that was a great presentation, and you guys deserve a ton of credit for bringing that to the table. But one of the underlying things he talked about throughout his whole presentation was the overlay district in Georgetown and the significance of that. And so I think it's important to understand there is a true plus to doing what has been proposed and what has been recommended and approved in this comprehensive plan update, and that's creating this historic overlay district. Don't fear the rezoning of properties as part of that conversion, okay? The rezoning of the properties is going to true up the use today. I don't know that we've got any real uses that are currently taking place in the historic area, the historic zone, that would not be zoned according to their current use. I really don't. Because in large part it's commercial or it's residential. And in most cities, in their commercial zoning categories, they allow residential as part of the commercial zoning category. So don't fear that from that end of it. So you should not see any impact on your land use requirement if there's a move to try to go in and individually rezone the properties in this area. What you need to be careful about is the restrictions that come forward in the overlay area, the overlay restrictions. Those can be sometimes way over the top, and sometimes they can be weak. And it's a matter of the challenge that you as a task force, the board, the Historic Society working with the board, P&Z and others, are going to have to find that mid-ground that accomplishes really what it is this community wants to accomplish in the way of protecting and preserving our historic district. One of the things you also have to do is you have to properly identify the district. And one of the things they found out when they were going through the process is they looked at the map that was set up in the original comp plan as far as the historic district, and it was missing some parts, some key parts. Some that are in the city and some that aren't. We can't zone outside of our city limits, but in our ETJ, we can certainly designate historic pieces of the community. And I think the feeling of the comp plan board was we needed to recognize those and identify those and recognize the fact that someday they may come into the village, and so we're jump starting. We're going to include them in our district even though we can't impose a regulation on them as far as that situation goes. So you can see here the revised map. It incorporates the cemeteries, which our previous map didn't. It incorporates the plantation to the southeast, which it doesn't. It incorporates the new Methodist Church, the historic Methodist Church location. We've basically tried to roll everything. We've included the house north of the cemetery there on 35. And we're in the middle of, we're literally having to go back in and recreate each of the maps in the comp plan. We thought it was going to be an easy fix, but we're going back in to make them more clear and make them more understandable. But this is what the new district map looks like for the historic district. Maybe a little hard to read from up there, and we can get you guys copies and post it online too. But this is basically with the changes that we approved in the review process. So that is all it is. And I will tell you that the best way to take a look at it is properties have a base zoning, and then you have additional regulations that you can add to those. The additional regulations are part of the overlay district. They're part of the overlay blanket that go on top of your base zoning for a piece of property. So that's it. I will tell you these type of regulations, if and when they move through the process, which I think you're going to be hearing about in the coming weeks, these type of regulations will not go without plenty of public input opportunity. Anytime you amend the zoning code, you're obligated to notify the public. The Planning and Zoning Commission will hold a public hearing on it, and the Board of Aldermen will hold a public hearing on it before any changes are ever effected. So you're going to have ample opportunity to come weigh in when those changes come forward. I think we're not going to push and not going to rush the process in the development of the restrictions relating to the overlay district, because again, I think we want to make sure we've got adequate input from the Historic Society as well as other parties who have interest in this. So that's what I've got right now. I've tried to keep it as brief as possible. Sometimes I get a little long-winded, I apologize. Sometimes I have a tendency to repeat, but I'd be available to answer any questions if you have any. And if I don't have the answer, I'll get you the answer. Yes, ma'am.
Just can you post that online for us?
Yes, ma'am, I can. I will do it. Yes, ma'am, in the back.
I can't really tell how far it extends, but I know that on Main Street there are homes that are not historical that got built. Should those homes later on be torn down and redeveloped? Because I'm thinking of a property that if I had the money, I would have done that with. Can this overlay make them have to comply to a more historic look?
Absolutely. That is the whole purpose and intent. That is the whole, it recognizes the fact that that house may have been built 20 years ago and it doesn't seem to match the character of the area, but if that home gets raised and a new one comes back in, either for a business or a home, then it's going to be built to a standard that fits in the neighborhood. What other questions? You hit that, that's a great question, by the way. Yes, ma'am.
How do y'all go about choosing people for those committees?
It'll be a board.
Let me ask one thing. When you have a question, if you would turn enough that the audience can hear the question, because a lot of times we'll hear the answer, but we didn't know what the question was. So if you have a question, and you'll stand up and turn and be loud enough that we can all hear the question before he answers it.
Can I stand up? Would that be easier for y'all? Whatever.
All right, you can repeat the question.
Yeah, her question was, how does the committee get chosen, the task force get chosen to go through the selection process? And I will tell you it's a board decision from that standpoint, but I'll also tell you you've got two aldermen right here that are going to be involved in that decision-making process. I don't want to speak for them, but I know that there'll be a public call issued for interest in working on this group. I know they're going to specifically ask Judy, as chairman of the society, to bring representation to the table. How big that committee is, I don't know how big it's going to be. I think it needs to be at least 5 members, maybe 7 members. They may want to put, some members from P&Z on there in addition to maybe a member or 2 from Ford. I don't know. We haven't gotten to that point in the process, but it will be a final decision, will be a board decision.
The old map of the historic district that we have, if the board approves this, what we're doing here, that map of the historic district won't exist as a zoning district anymore. It'll be zoned as you mentioned, commercial or residential. The zoning actually will be all there. Now, and then what replaces what was the historic district map is the historic district overlay map. Now, this thing up here is an overlay that goes over a zoning map, right? Right. So this is an overlay district map, and the old district map is...
The old district map would go away. This basically is intended to represent the boundaries of that old district map and some expanded areas.
Right. Right. But that does not become a zoning map.
No.
That's an overlay district map. The second one was, we talked about if you implement this policy, just the timing of when you say, okay, now we're going to go ahead and rezone all these properties and all that stuff, and put that in effect, and they say, and then I will take a look at the implementation of the historic district overlay restrictions. I just want to ensure that there's not a gap between those two events, because if you have now the zoning out there, some people might sneak in and say, well, I want to get in now before they figured out what they want to do, and I'm hoping that at least the restrictions that we have in place, historic district restrictions, they'll carry over until we modify them as it comes to that. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And I think what you do is you probably time them to go into effect at the same time. Translation, you time any rezoning that takes place to go into effect at the same time the overlay district goes into effect. That way the regulations are consistent up until that ultimate conversion.
Yeah, thanks, Don.
Sure. And I envision, I may be wrong, but I envision that there will at least be the basic restrictions we have right now included in the overlay. So you should have some overlapping protection with some additional, I hope. Yes, ma'am.
I think it'd be better to go up here.
Sure.
You correct me if I'm wrong. I really just came because I wanted to figure out why we have to get rid of the historic district and go to this other. Right now, if a house is built 20 years ago, it doesn't matter. We weren't even a village 20 years ago, or just barely going in close to 20. So we're a relatively new village. The people, I think Vic Means was on the committee, the people who started the village decided to make a historic district. This isn't Georgetown. Georgetown didn't do that. They ended up getting so many things going on that they had to quickly make historic overlay before their whole village turned into McDonald's and whatnot. This village decided, no, we'll have a whole historic district. I don't know if that's good or bad, but it's from the Fowler House all the way down to the tippy end of Main Street and up around the Rose Mansion as a historic district, around Center Circle. You cannot, according to the ordinance right now, or the zoning, or whatever we want to call it, you cannot put a McDonald's there, can't have a drive-through in this village. And people say, well, what about, it's down there at the subway, or whatever that is, whatever it is down there. That they quickly built those things before we were a village, and I think they've gone back and said they can't do that. You can have a drive-through. You can't have garage, a gas station, and you can't have a multi-mixed apartment shops. We do have those multi-mixed buildings already in town. There are, I think, 3 of them, but they were here already before the historic district became, this is the rule. You can't do that kind of building. Now, if there's other things, I'm not sure. The rest of it, the people doing the comprehensive plan said, you can have anything. We have bed and breakfast, we have restaurants, we have individual homes, we have, what else is around here? Retail, not commercial, retail. We don't really have any commercial in the town except across the highway. So this is what we had. Now, I just really wanted to figure out, why does it have to change? I foresee a change meeting. I've got to get up and argue against things or for things constantly being changed, when it's really pretty clear and simple. You can't have a garage, gas station here on this side of the highway. That isn't here already. We do have one, but it's here. It was here before we were a village. You can't have another gas station. You can't have a drive-through McDonald's or whatever. And you can't have any more multi-mixed-use buildings. We already have 3 of them, I think, on the Main Street. And that seems not unreasonable to me. But I'm just trying to figure out, why do we have to start renaming everything and making it more rigid in some ways and less rigid in other ways? And I really don't want to go to more meetings to argue why somebody shouldn't have to be allowed to do a conditional use permit. We've got a lot of empty land on Main Street, and I'm just trying to figure out what makes sense. Why did we have to do this change, and what is it going to mean?
Well, I think the first and foremost, the question is, the change is to bring ourselves into a current state in the way cities do business, and that is you typically zone land based on that use or the intended use as set forth in the comprehensive plan. It says, you're exactly right, no McDonald's. But there's a lot of retail that's zoned historic district that should be zoned retail. It should be zoned according to the use and according to the planned use set forth in the comprehensive plan, if at all possible. That's issue 1. Then you create the overlay to address exactly what you're talking about, that historic area, and to incorporate that. And that's not fixed. Keep in mind, you can always expand that district. You can always reduce that district if you want to. But you're zoning land according to the use and the intended use, as far as how it's being used, and then you're setting the additional restrictions on to protect the historic aspect of it and the character of the community. Yes, ma'am.
Okay, I think I'm loud enough without the mic.
It never hurts. It doesn't hurt.
I don't like
Unless
mics.
you got a big mouth like me, right?
Well, I can be louder. Okay, now let me think what I was going to say. Okay, with this, if this overlay goes into place, which that's what I want to see, how would the protections do you come up with the protections and what it's going to mean first, and then it goes in with it, or once it becomes an overlay, then do you go back?
No, you'll develop the protections. But you don't have, you get the protections designed and developed first before you implement the district.
The overlay. Okay.
Yeah.
And then I'm going to answer the question of why I am very much for this overlay and not keeping it the way it is that you didn't answer. Pace Park, and I know Mr. Cole, I think it was you, was all for it getting zoned as a park, and I spoke against it. It's not that I'm against it being zoned as a park. I am all for that, because once it's zoned as a park, then you can apply for grants, and you can make Pace Park a destination that it should be. But I want to make sure it's the overlay protecting it, and I wish I had pictures. Midland, Texas has a park called Dennis the Menace, and you go look at it, it is every child's dream park. It is bright, it is plastic, it is tall, it is big, and it would be so inappropriate for Salado. You go to San Angelo on the Concho River or to Ruidoso, they both have incredible parks. They're made out of wood. They look like forts. Oh my gosh, something like that at Pace Park would be a destination. And that's what my dream is, that, that would happen for Pace Park. And it's not going to happen if you keep it just historic, because you've got to have those grants.
Linda, you're right. Thank you so much for your comments, and you're exactly accurate in what you're saying. Don't fear change. I think there's a fear that when we go through a rezoning process on land in an area, that we're going to start rezoning everybody's property against what it is they're using and what they're doing right now. As I mentioned before, far from it, because just about everything in this area is totally appropriate for your comprehensive plan. I don't know of any that are really in conflict per se to speak of. This is just pure and simply a way to do it the right way and utilize overlays the way they're intended to be utilized and zone property the way it's intended to be zoned from a land use standpoint. Again, I ask you, what is historic district as far as the land use goes? It's an area, a historic area, by look, by character, by feel, and the way you typically address those is you address those in an overlay format as opposed to zoning it historic district. Not critical of the past. Things need to be updated. That's one of the things that I would strongly stress in this situation, and I'll stress to the board if and when we get to this process, and that is the fact that you don't just adopt it once. These need to be revisited on a regular basis to make sure they're accomplishing what it is they're supposed to accomplish, to make sure no one's crossing that line, or maybe we didn't think about this aspect of it, maybe we need to look at updating the regulations and put this into it. Those are all issues to think about and look at. I mean, we had a discussion, I'll give you an example about some of the protections. We've got a gentleman up the street here on 35 who's doing some car lot sales. And he is interested in displaying cars on the side of the road. Well, he has to have an all-weather surface for his parking area. And his comment is, I look downtown and there's gravel parking lots all over downtown. Why do I have to? Because that's something specific to the historic district, the historic area. Those are the type of regulations that you put in. We've got some of them in the district regulations right now, but our feeling is it's more appropriate, it's more understanding, it's more kosher to do it through an overlay format and zone land based on its use, its actual use, and intended use. Yes, sir.
Yeah, about 10 or 15 years ago, I was really involved in Historical Society. One of our meetings, we talked about labeling where the historic district is, because it's really remote. So I kind of got the task to come up with the signs, which you've seen around the buildings now, and they're unfortunately faded, but anyhow, there's about a dozen of them that more or less outline the historic district. I didn't really have much to go, and I did it single-handedly. I didn't ask anybody. I just stuck the signs in. They're still there.
You did a great job.
But anyhow, my question is, I see this up here, and I'm not quite oriented with where all the parts are. Would it be possible to add to this overlay what the old historic district was?
Sure.
So that we can see kind of the before and after?
Sure we can, absolutely.
That's really all I had.
Absolutely. No areas have been taken away, we've only added to it. And that's kind of what I was getting at. We talked to Linda about that when we were through the process. That's the thing to understand. We've expanded it. And quite frankly, there's probably room for more expansion. But they tried to hit the areas they could hit, you know, in an understandable fashion. It looks a little weird because you've got a couple of separated pieces here and there. It's not all contiguous, but there's nothing wrong with that. Nothing wrong with that at all. They can be that way. Other questions? John?
Yeah, I'm grateful on the target of opportunity. About the comment about the park, yeah, you're right, I did want to get it rezoned, but to maintain the integrity of Salado. Nothing bad, I want to be clear about that, okay? Because we do need the grant money to do that. The second thing is if this new overlay.
John? Yeah, really.
Yes, sir, please.
You have a quiet voice.
Well, this overlay business, I'm all for it. I think it's a great thing. So, is it possible to build in to the restrictions, or whatever we're going to call it, of existing buildings when they become up for renewal, renovation, whatever? Can they fall more in line with the historic appearance? So we maintain the celebrity, the integrity of Salado from soup to nuts, front to rear.
Sure.
Because I hate to see a building pop up that looks like something that doesn't match downtown Salado. I think Salado's beautiful. I think if it's possible, maybe not so much use the word force the owner, but encourage the owner to fall under a design criteria that fits in with Salado.
Exactly what it's all about, John.
Good. Thank you. What it's all about.
Well, we have criteria with the Historical Society. We're not a member, but we do have criteria that, you know, it's not mandatory. In Georgetown, it was mandatory for people to come to the Historic Society, or the, I can't think what their name is, but to get approval for that, and it's based on federal guidelines, too.
In fact, you can actually get grants if that house needs to be, or the owners would like to conform that house to the historical area, like the little brick house, the red brick house by the coffee McCain's. That's completely out of, it just doesn't look like it needs to be there. After this overlay, and from the historical commission, something, name like that, you can actually apply to the state for bond to help them, I'm just going to say construct or redesign that house in the front area to make it look historical. Correct, Don?
Yeah, the thing you got to be careful with, and this is, I'll give you an example in the Braunfels, and I was involved down there when there was the initial push to create a historic district down there, and two of probably the biggest advocates for historic preservation in the Braunfels. I'm not going to give their names, but two of the nicest and bravest people you'd ever run into. They were all about preserving the German history all the way back into the 1800s. And when the city came in and said, we're there with you, we're going to go all the way on the deal, and they sat there and put regulations in place, and they started talking about how curves had to be. They started talking about the the historic requirements to the point that it got so burdensome and so costly to go through the historic restoration process. Again, like I said, you got to be careful you don't go too far. They became two of the biggest opponents, which was so contradictory to their public position. But they eventually were able to get the city to pull the brakes back and say, let's get realistic with this thing and give people, number one, the freedom. People aren't dumb. People know what looks right. They know what feels right in most cases in an area. They give them the freedom. You just give them the guidelines, and you can do that. But Merle's exactly right. Depending on how far you go, depending on whether your building has certain types of markers, you've got city markers, but if you've got state and federal markers, they don't get into what you're doing inside the house. Their main concern is the exterior. But some of that grant money is out there and available. You sometimes, well, Stagecoach, I'll give you an example. Stagecoach had an opportunity to get some pretty good money from the state. They went through a review process, got stamped and approved. We got the notification, and they said they weren't going to do it because at that stage of the game, they felt it was going to be too cost prohibitive to follow their standards. But you can. What Merle's saying is exactly right. There's some money out there. Limited as it is, there's some out there, particularly federal more than state at this stage. What other questions? Yes, sir.
So I've heard some people comment about being for this change and some against it. And I understand exactly what you described. What I'm not certain about is who established the current criteria for the current historic district zoning, and then who would provide input under the new model?
The historic zoning scenario that we have right now that's in place was adopted after the initial adoption of our comprehensive plan by the Board of Aldermen, the Planning and Zoning Commission, some members of which may be here tonight that were part of that process. And they did a great job of setting it up and getting the ball rolling. And we're just at that point of change. Who has input at this point of change? Everyone. Everyone.
And I suspect that's part of, adapting to change is understanding that you still have some amount of control. So to hear that, I think makes a difference.
Yeah, I will tell you, decisions like this, overlay district decisions are not easy decisions because they take time. But the reason they take time is because you try your best to seek out as much input as possible. With the first issue, you've got to decide, and that is what are we trying to accomplish. And then the second issue is how do we get around to get to that point. It takes time, but rest assured, the input process, I would guess, again, I've not set the process up, but I would guess that what would more than likely happen is your task force is going to be a combined task force with representatives of the society, P&Z, board, citizen reps. They probably will hold public comment, much like tomorrow night there's a minimum lot task force meeting to gather public comment before they make recommendations. Then when it goes to the board, with whatever recommendations task force comes up, they kick it to P&Z for more public input. So there's going to be a rather extensive process. It's not going to happen in 2 months. It's not going to happen in 3 months. It's probably something that's going to happen in about 6 months as far as the process goes. But everyone has an opportunity.
Great. Thanks, Tom.
Thank you, sir. Jim, do you want to say something? Jim chaired the comp plan. I don't know if you want to offer any comments on, did we get the points?
No,
This is Jim Lasker, for those of you who don't know.
What I'd say summarily, Don, is you've done an excellent job of outlining what an overlay district is and what it can be. And as I would go back and say, it's a blanket, it's additional protection for something you deem to be very special. And the content that comes out of the committee should be decisive, it should be heavily talked about, it shouldn't be a very short process at all, I doubt it will be. The representation on it has to be very fair, very respectful of the Historic Society, respectful of the Planning Commission and the aldermen that have to live with those not necessarily live with, but decide upon those recommendations that are made. So when that time comes, I have no idea who those people will be, but it's the old saying, if there's garbage in, there'll be garbage out. And so got to have people that are really committed to the task and are willing to speak, not just nod their head in approval. It really needs some great input in that process. And no, I don't care to be Georgetown. I don't mind mixed-use developments or mixed-use properties on Main Street. Some of the most beautiful places I've seen in my life are in New England, some of the towns around Boston and places like that, where the Hall of Fame is, and people live upstairs and have retail downstairs. I'd like to see that. And Mr. Cole said, do you put a hammer down on everybody's head with respect to what exactly they're going to do? No, I don't think you do, because you won't like the things, in my opinion, that come out of it. But you strongly encourage that input from those people. And I think that's one of the things that the Comprehensive Plan Committee came up with, was we really want to see encouragement, not a heavy hand in the process by the leaders, but by the developers and the people coming in here that want to understand the historical nature and will understand it with the type of capital investments that would be required on Main Street today. It's expensive to develop today, very expensive. Land prices in Salado are not low. They're not bargains by most people's standards today, and that's fine with me. I don't need to make it cheap. I don't need construction cheap, but the cost of that would be very significant on Main Street. And I think people that are doing that, by and large, would be very respectful of what they think is going to work and what fits into the community. And I think a strong presence in the overlay really is the cornerstone of them working with the Historical Society and others to get that accomplished. So it's to me, it's the most important thing for this community in terms of maintaining and creating, as time goes forward, the character that we wish it continues to be. And I do believe that's possible. And I believe it's far more possible to have that picture 10 or 20 years from now. Maybe if we're still here, I'm here, I'd love to see it, but I would like to see that be the case, where redevelopment of downtown paid great homage to the Historical Society and to the historical significance of Salado, and we have to do that through some reasonable guidelines presented by the task force to the Planning Commission, to the aldermen. So you know, times change, Salado's change. You can't just stay in the same framework that Salado was in 1970 or 1980s. It was a great place. I got here in terms of some investments in the early 2000s, and I've seen change there too. We all have. So it's working with that change, but as I said, the cornerstone of the whole thing is, particularly in the historic district, is to maintain our historic culture. And I'm all for that in every way, shape, and form. And that's really all I can say. Don, I think you did an excellent job of presenting it. And
the one thing
I don't always agree with you, so.
No, we don't.
But I do think you did a very fair job of representing it, and I think there's a lot of room for progress, and I don't fear that process with the parameters in place coming out of a good committee and supported by the Planning Commission. Thank you. It was
Thank you, Jim.
a privilege to be here.
The one thing that he mentioned that probably warrants some additional comment on briefly, whatever the regulations are that are put in place should not be subjective, and they need to be definitive. And the way we've got it written right now is it's wide open to subjectivity. And if we're wanting good development, we need to be sound, and we need to be definitive with our regulation. Not heavy-handed, but understandable and reasonable, you know, in such a fashion that someone can pick that code book up and read it and say, this is what I can do. And I'm not subject to going to try to beg what colors are right and what colors are wrong. If we've got a color preference we want, as far as our paints and those type of things, put it in the book. Put it in the book to the point that someone's not having to come up and you give that person white, and you give that person purple, and you give that person chartreuse. Define the color. The case in San Antonio years ago down in the King William district will tell you that very clearly. Define the color when the purple house got built. And so think positive about it. Don't fear change. It's 2019, and I think it's a step forward. It's not a step backward. It's a building block that we're taking the opportunity and taking advantage of at this point. That's all I've got.
Can I ask a question?
Yes, ma'am.
Is the zoning going to change on Main Street any? Are you looking to see, are you thinking that's going to change?
I mean, the proper way to do what we're talking about doing is to go in and zone each one of those properties based on their use. So the answer to that question is yes. It would go from historic district to local retail and those type of things. But on top of that local retail would be what we're talking about through this historic overlay protection. So in some cases, tighter regulations. In some cases, probably very similar regulations. I don't see lesser regulation by anything that we're doing.
You know, Main Street is the chicken trade, and that should be historic.
Hence the
Everything
reason
along Main Street should be.
that's why we've got in the district, and that's what we've got to try to protect. And there are some parts of our neighborhoods, as you well know, that trail went through too, that need to be protected from that standpoint, and add significant value to land values in this town, as well as historic values. So again, I think that's the whole goal, is to protect. Don't fear the rezoning process. That's simply to try to attach a zoning that matches the land use. That's all that is. The bigger issue in this thing is the overlay and the type of requirements we're going to put in the overlay to try to preserve and protect. Anything else? Yes, sir.
When
Yes, ma'am. Excuse me. I thought it was recording. My eyes are bad, believe me.
it happens all the time. When Subway was going in several years ago,
Yes, ma'am.
we went to them and asked them the architectural to stay within, and they complied. They went right with it.
You're so true. Most people don't realize that. And what you said is exactly the case. In today's thought process, a lot of times all it takes is going to somebody and asking them or showing them in writing what it is you're wanting. The problem and the conflict comes in development when you have this void, this gap of subjectivity that's in there that you're thinking, oh Lord, I'm going to have to go before this board, and they're going to have a bad day, or they're going to have a problem with me, or they don't like the pickup truck I drove in, and they only like people that drive cars like Troy, and those type of things. So I mean, you're so true in what you're saying. A lot of times it just asks, and Jim will testify to that too. Even in big commercial development, and I'm not talking big commercial development in the historic district, but even in big commercial development, the days have changed. The Walmarts of the world, the Targets of the world, those people a lot of times will build to suit in the environment that they're going into. Some don't, but the bulk of them will in this day and age. And the same with the small. I guarantee you, somebody who comes in and buys a piece of property on Main Street is going to try to make it look like Main Street. And they're going to want it to look like Main Street. We just need to define for them what Main Street needs to look like. What else? Yeah.
Another example of that is where Central Land is, and Griffith Gallery on Main Street right over here.
Yes.
The lovely people that bought the property from, that purchased it from Larry, were going to build a Santa Fe look. And all we did was talk to them about it and say that really would not fit in Salado. Would you consider this? And they built those cute buildings there. But that's all you have to do is just give them some direction.
That's it. And that's what they
That's
need.
what they want.
Yeah, at the beginning, not halfway through the process.
Right. It's too late.
Because we in this business a lot of times have a tendency to come back and say, whoa, 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 after they poured their slab foundation and that type of situation. So it's a matter of just painting the picture for them and doing a good job of defining what it is we're after. Yes, sir. Now, Troy.
A lot of people don't realize it, but the Salado Square hasn't been there forever. It was created by Darwin Britt. He was came in the late 70s, they actually brought that material from Santa Ana, Texas to Salado and reconstructed the storefront. So that's a good example of what can be done.
People want to invest in this community because they want to be part of that look and part of that feel, because they recognize that's what draws people. They don't want to put a CVS on the middle of Main Street, and we don't want a CVS on the middle of Main Street. Thank you all very much. I hope I helped a little bit. So have a great night.
If you're not a member of the Historical Society, we encourage you to join, and we send out memos and emails as newsletters informing you of what's going on with the historical district and situations like this. We need to preserve what we've got, but you do have to think forward. Otherwise, if you're stagnant, you die. So we want to keep our village as what it is in the ambiance, but it takes your knowledge and your interest to tell us what do we want to do. Thank you all so much for coming out. We sincerely appreciate it.
And thanks Susan Bradshaw for baking a cake.
And if you have suggestions, appreciate that. Be sure and give those to me.